I woke before dawn on the morning my son was supposed to marry, with the house holding its breath the way I did. Spreadsheets glowed on my laptop, but the numbers were fog. What I was tallying were 25 years of trust against a handful of new lies. Franklin's phone slept face down, his laughter dimmed when I entered rooms, and Madison's attention bent toward him with a gravity I tried to ignore. At 5, I brewed coffee I didn't drink and sat in my home office, convincing myself that nerves can mimic warnings. Elisha patted in, hair flattened by sleep, a mug steaming in his hand. "Mom, you've been up for hours," he said, smile not quite convincing. I told him perfection takes time, that the lawn had to gleam and the string lights couldn't have a single dead bulb. He perched on my desk, suddenly boy small, and asked if Madison truly loved him. I offered the usual comfort about jitters, but his stare kept searching past my words. He said she spent extra time with his father lately, talking investments and mentorship, plans that seemed to skip the groom. I closed the laptop and squeezed his fingers, promising later. After he left, I called the caterer with a lie about an emergency and cleared my morning because the air felt crowded by secrets I couldn't name. At 10, Madison's white BMW ghosted up our drive. She walked to the door with the effortless claim of someone who never asks permission. I slipped up the back, circled the hydrangeas I'd nursed through spring, and knelt behind their heavy blooms to watch the living room window like a screen. Franklin let her in. He poured her a drink at the fireplace where our Christmas photos live, and the distance between them behaved like a rumor that knew it was true. A palm at her back lingered. Her smile rose to meet it. His eyes softened into the man I hadn't met in years. Certainty slid into me, clean and cold. I started toward the door, heat roaring in my ears, ready to rip the moment open. Movement upstairs snagged me. A shadow in the banister glass. Then Elijah, still as a verdict, watching too. My anger scattered and regrouped into something harder. Below, the inevitable arrived without apology. His hands in her hair, her mouth on his, a kiss that did not pretend to be an accident. I pressed my nails into my palms and tasted metal. The woman I had been, a fixer, a forgiver, went quiet. A hand found my sleeve in the shrubs. Elijah, pale and precise, whispered, "Not yet." I wanted to explode the scene, to defend him, but his eyes held a plan I hadn't known he owned. "Mom, I already know, and it's worse than you think." In the glass, I saw my face set like wet concrete. I looked back through the window, then at my son, and understood the next right thing was not noise, but proof. I breathed once and nodded. In that breath, I buried the version of myself who preferred a private scene and a salvaged lie, and made room for the woman who would insist on daylight. The wedding waited on the lawn like a story we could still refuse to tell. I rose among the hydrangeas, smoothed my dress, and followed Elijah away from the window, carrying the broken morning like evidence I would use. The day had begun with doubt. It ended with a resolve sharp enough to cut clean. Elijah didn't waste time with comfort. Doubt had already starved us of that. In the quiet of my office, door locked, he told me he'd hired a private investigator weeks ago, because love deserves truth, even when the truth arrives with a blade. The name cut twice. Aisha Whitfield, my sister, retired cop turned PI. He'd gone to her after a Tuesday lunch he'd been told was a business meeting. The timestamps later said it was something else. He handed me his phone. Photographs marched past. Hotel awnings, lobby clocks. A hand at a waist that wasn't mine. Madison's smile lifting like a habit. 17 sightings, he said, and his voice did not shake. I felt the cold arithmetic of betrayal. Patterns, not accidents. Then came the money. Aisha had followed it the way rivers are followed to their source, line by line through our accounts. Cash withdrawals kept under thresholds, shuffled between branches, loans against my retirement, papered with a signature that mimicked mine the way a mockingbird mimics a hymn. Receipts stitched a necklace I never wore to a bank card Franklin guarded like a secret. I wanted to rage. Instead, I listened, because listening is what saved me. Aisha, on speaker, was all brass tacks and soft edges. She said there was more, and tilted. Regular payments to a name I didn't know, Nicole Jenkins. Stretching back 15 years. A daughter, Zoe. Preliminary DNA pointed at paternity with numbers that leave no room for charm. I pressed my palm to the desk and breathed until the world steadied. In the space between breaths, I felt the old marriage loosen its grip like a knot that has finally met the right knife. Elijah watched me, ready to catch what he had just broken open. "We can't argue with them in private," he said. "They'll turn smoke into facts." He was right. I could already hear Franklin's soothing denials, Madison's practiced tears. So we planned daylight. Aisha had the projector wired to a laptop disguised as a slideshow crate. One button would lift the stage curtain and let the evidence do the speaking. I laid out my own countermeasures. Divorce papers already signed and notarized, a flash drive with copies of every file, and a will to stop apologizing for asking to be respected. After midnight, I slipped into the bathroom and slid Franklin's toothbrush into a plastic bag, a small theft in the service of larger thefts named and proven. I set it in the mailbox for Aisha's pre-dawn pickup, then sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and counted the tiles until panic passed. The house felt like a museum of a life that had closed. Every picture frame was a plaque. At 2 a.m, I texted Elijah one word, "Ready," and he replied with the same. When sleep finally came, it was thin and merciful. Afternoon arrived, honey bright and almost smug, the kind of sky that believes in happy endings, and I moved through it with the quiet of a stagehand who already knows where the trapdoor sits. I checked the arch I'd trained with wire and patience, touched each rose like a password, and walked the aisles to feel the symmetry calm my pulse. Guests drifted and sat in clusters, carrying laughter the way children carry sparklers, careless, delighted, unaware of where the sparks might land. Franklin played host, glass in hand, charisma set to a volume that used to disarm me. He gathered backs into friendly slaps, borrowed warmth from every conversation, then came to borrow mine. "Perfect day," he murmured at my ear, and I answered perfect, because the word would be truer soon for reasons he couldn't imagine. Elijah stood with his groomsmen, still as a lighthouse, eye scanning tectonic plates the crowd couldn't feel shifting underfoot. Aisha, dressed in server black and anonymity, moved between tables with a tray on her palm and a mission in her pocket. Cables slept beneath tablecloths, the projector waited like a held breath, and the remote in my clutch felt the way certainty feels, small, simple, decisive. When the quartet began, a hush braided itself through conversation, and we all faced the aisle stitched with petals. Madison appeared in lace and light, the garden making room for her, the way water makes room for anything that falls into it. She floated toward the altar, radiant and rehearsed, eyes flickering past me to land on Franklin. Their look was half-second and encyclopedic. I felt no stab, only a note of confirmation, like a banker initialing a ledger page already balanced. The officiant opened his leather-bound book, and the words about love and constancy rose like birds that had never met a storm. I let them pass overhead without anger, because I was done arguing with weather. Bows followed, hers steady, his rich with practiced sincerity, and I marked each one like I marked deductions I know an auditor will question later. Elijah's hands did not shake when he took the ring. He had inherited my stillness for when fires start. I watched the faces, Judge Ellington with his granite certainty, Madison's mother tender and proud, Franklin's colleagues primed to be charmed, and I found, to my surprise, a slice of pity for the part of them about to be reintroduced to reality. The wind lifted a corner of the program in my lap. The paper tapped my knee like a cue. When the officiant reached the line that is meant to stir old ghosts, if anyone knows a reason, silence pooled, bright and heavy. I stood, felt 300 heads turn toward me, and let the ripple pass through the lawn. "I have a reason," I said, my voice steady as a metronome. Franklin's hand caught my elbow, the gesture gentle and ferocious at once, but I was already beyond choreography. I faced the crowd, then my son, and finally the screen. I pressed the red button. The slideshow that wasn't a slideshow woke, and the first image arrived with surgical clarity. Their kiss in my living room, daylight honest on their faces. The garden inhaled hard. I did not look at Franklin because I have learned not to watch lies sprint. I advanced the story instead. Hotel doors, lobby clocks, hands straying, timestamps that kept better promises than people. Denials began to swarm like summer flies, photoshopped, misunderstanding, pressure, and I let the numbers answer. Withdrawals under the threshold, forged signatures with my loops rehearsed but not mine, a necklace receipt glowing like a lighthouse toward a coast no one wanted to land on. I held the remote and the room together and remembered the exact second I had decided to prefer truth to peace. I didn't let the uproar steer me. I steered it. While gas braided through the lawn and chairs creaked, I advanced the slides with the calm I bring to audits, line by line until the picture could not pretend to be blurry. I said I wished this were a misunderstanding, but receipts don't lie, and neither did the footage. Franklin tried indignation, wounded pride, and a plea for privacy, but each mask slid off as timestamps glowed beside his smile. Then I shifted the lens. "This isn't only adultery," I said, and the crowd quieted. Up came the withdrawals, always shy of flags. Up came the loans against my pension, signed with a hand that could copy my loops, but not my intent. Up came the Cartier receipt, and Madison wearing the necklace at her bachelor dinner. Her mother's knuckles whitened, her father's jaw set. Madison tried to speak, but the screen answered faster than words. I brought up the embezzlement trail Aisha had mapped, fake vendor invoices, a shell company from a maiden name, transfers washing into a private account, purchases that matched gifts Franklin bragged were bargains. Partners from her firm stared like surgeons at a scan. One began to dial. The final slide filled the canvas with numbers that do not negotiate. Probability of paternity, 99.999%. And beside it, Zoe's bright, unblameable face. My voice shook only there, from the ache of wasted years. Silence followed, almost kind. Then the world moved. Madison folded to the grass, lace collapsing like a bad investment. Franklin did what cowards do when stories stick. He ran. He bolted through cousins and colleagues, sprinting for the parking area as if distance could edit history. Aisha stepped from behind the oak, small and steady, and interrupted his escape with a simple trip. He sprawled on our lawn, grass-stained and human. Two officers threaded through the murmurs, moving toward the altar with the patience of people accustomed to stages. They weren't there for the family drama, they were there for the crime. "Madison Ellington," one said, voice polite as weather, "you're under arrest on suspicion of embezzlement and wire fraud." The handcuffs clicked in a way I will remember longer than vows. Her parents looked at me as if I had rewritten their daughter. I looked back with the only mercy I had left, the truth. Phones filmed, the quartet lowered their bows, and the projector's fan kept purring. Elijah left the altar and came to my side, his hand a quiet anchor. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. I told the crowd the ceremony was over, that copies of the evidence would be available, then asked the caterer to serve dinner to anyone who wanted to eat. In my peripheral vision, I saw Franklin sit up, smaller than I had ever allowed him to be. A child cried, confused by adult words like affidavit and indictment. I felt tired the way ocean rocks are tired, rounded, enduring, still here. I pressed the remote one last time and the screen went dark, and for the first time all day, I believed the light belonged to me. Neighbors who had watched Elijah learn to ride a bike stared over clasped hands. A colleague of Franklin's stepped back. Judge Ellington's certainty thinned to a stunned quiet. Murmurs moved like a tide. I steadied my breath and thanked Aisha in my head for bringing daylight to dark corners. Truth is slow, I reminded myself, but undefeated when it finally arrives. I asked the planner to inventory rentals and document damages. Life still requires lists, even after explosions. The hours after the explosion moved like thick syrup. slow and sticky, and I waded through them with the same stubborn focus I bring to closing a year's books. There were statements to give, vendors to settle, chairs to stack, and a projector to power down that was still warm with the truth we'd asked it to carry. The police took my accounts beneath the arch I had trained with my hands, their pens scratching as I answered each question clearly, grateful for anything that required accuracy more than emotion. I watched the florist collect centerpieces that suddenly looked like apologies, told the planner to photograph damages for insurance, and signed an amended invoice with a steadiness that surprised me. Elijah stayed close, an unobtrusive orbit, bringing me water, answering relatives, declining interviews as microphones hovered like persistent insects. When the last guest drifted away and the last cable coiled into a bin, the lawn felt like a stage after the curtain. Confetti in the grass, silence heavy as sandbags, a story that had decided its own ending. At home, I rinsed champagne from a stack of glasses and realized I was scrubbing a party that never happened. The quiet clink of crystal sounded like punctuation. I slept for 3 hours, dreamless, and woke with a clarity people mistake for coldness. It wasn't ice, only a decision. I dressed in a simple black dress, put the notarized envelope in the flash drive into my purse, and drove to my attorney's office as if I were making a deposit, because I was, in a way, placing my future where it could earn interest. We filed. We attached exhibits. We requested injunctions regarding accounts I now knew too well. Back at the firm, my receptionist looked at me the way people look at survivors on the news. I thanked her, closed my door, and began the gentle work of notifying clients who deserved a heads up before the headlines did the telling for me. By afternoon, the story had learned to sprint. A drone shot of the ruined ceremony looped under a crawl of words that felt both intimate and absurd. I turned the television off and made a list. Cancel rentals, reschedule tax reviews, change passwords, freeze lines of credit, schedule a forensic review of every account with my name near it. Lists saved me when feelings threatened to vote themselves permanent. Aisha texted updates in precise bursts. Chain of custody, charges logged, follow-up interviews, then added one soft line. Proud of you. I stared at those 3 words until my eyes watered, then replied with a heart I had not used for Franklin in months. Elijah came by with takeout and put extra soy sauce on my desk, like a peace offering to a war I hadn't started. We ate in the conference room where I had once coached clients through audits, and I realized that truth cleans differently than bleach. That night, I boxed what the house no longer needed: the framed photo of our first Christmas, cufflinks I polished for promotions that were not ours, the guest book with blank lines. I labeled each lid with a black marker, printed, neat, controlled. When exhaustion finally found me, it wasn't the collapse of someone defeated, but the settling of concrete after it's poured, still soft at the surface, already load-bearing underneath. Tomorrow would bring paperwork, lawyers, and the long patience of consequences. But I had already done the hardest math. I could live without the story that had been sold to me. 2 weeks later, a plain envelope waited on my kitchen counter, like a guest who had let itself in, and I stood over it a long time before breaking the seal. Nicole Jenkins wrote without ornament. She was sorry. Zoe had learned the truth from the news. If I was willing, they wished to meet somewhere quiet. I carried that letter around the house as if it were a bowl of water I refused to spill, reading it once for anger, once for grief, and then again for the part of me that still believed in careful beginnings. When Elijah came by that evening, he read it with his jaw set and said without hesitation, "She's my sister, Mom. We should meet her." We chose a coffee shop halfway between our towns, a place where the baristas wrote names cheerfully on cubs and the windows let in an honest, forgiving light. I arrived early and learned the exits by heart, the way I do in hotel ballrooms during tax conferences. When they walked in, I finally understood what Aisha had tried to prepare me for. Zoe's eyes were Franklin's, alert, unafraid to take in the room, yet they held a softness that was wholly her own. She clutched a paperback like a shield. Nicole stood behind her with the posture of someone who has been breathing around a secret for years. Introductions were awkward in the way true things often are. Elijah went first, a gentle anchor, asking about school, about the book, about whether the matcha was any good here. He didn't chase the subject of fathers, and I loved him for that restraint. I asked if Zoe liked math or art better, and learned she loved both, that geometry felt like choreography, and that sketching made the world slow down enough to enter it. I told her, carefully, that none of this was her fault, not a single inch of it, and that the adults should have done better. She nodded without looking away. We met again the next week and the next, trading a public place for a quiet park and then, cautiously, for my townhouse dining table on a Sunday afternoon, where Elijah roasted chicken and pretended not to watch us watching each other. Zoe teased him about using too much rosemary, and I saw her smile reach both cheeks for the first time. Nicole and I were polite but honest, handling each other like antiques with obvious cracks, respectful of what we could salvage, realistic about what we could not. She said she had wanted to tell me many times and had talked herself out of it every time. I said I would have wanted to be told once, cleanly, and we let the conversation rest there. After dinner, Zoe asked to see my balcony rosebush, and I told her I'd kept only one plant from the old house, a survivor I refused to let die just because the address changed. She touched a leaf with 2 fingers and said, "It smells like morning." And I thought, yes, that is exactly right. Forgiveness did not arrive like a ceremony. It came like better sleep. I still kept 2 kinds of anger, one shaped like a lesson and one shaped like a boundary, but the useless kind thinned each time I chose the present tense over autopsy. At night, I stopped replaying the garden's gasp and started picturing Zoe bent over a library table, annotating poems, or Elijah showing her how to read a site plan, the 3 of us arguing fondly about whether a courtyard wants jasmine or bougainvillea. I kept Franklin outside my home and inside the truth, which felt like the correct distance for both of us. Aisha checked in with case updates written in crisp sentences and ended them with softer ones. "Proud of you. Drink water. You're doing well." And I kept those texts starred like talismans. When I finally told Zoe she could call me Simone or Miss Whitfield or nothing at all if titles felt heavy, she chose Simone, and then later Aunt Simone, with a grin that undid me. It was not the family I had been promised, but it was a family that kept its promises, and as small as it was, it fit. A year has a way of sifting what matters, and in the months that followed, I traded grandeur for accuracy until my life finally balanced again. I sold the big house that knew too many secrets and bought a modest town home with light that shows up honestly at 7 a.m. And on move-in day, I set one rose bush on the balcony like a witness who'd agreed to stay. My CPA firm wobbled, then steadied. Some clients vanished at the first whiff of scandal, but the ones who stayed brought friends who wanted quiet competence more than small talk, and I rebuilt the book of business the way I rebuild a spreadsheet, cell by cell, with notes in the margins that say why. I instituted new habits, daily reconciliations, 2-factor on everything, a standing date with my own finances each Friday so no one ever signs my name for me again. Elijah began to bloom in a way that made me want to applaud in grocery lines. Therapy helped him set his bones straight after the break, and then he pivoted toward landscape architecture, drafting courtyards that made strangers breathe slower. He'd bring rolled plans to my dining table, unfurled paper over dinner, and show me how a line becomes a path, a bench becomes an invitation, a tree becomes shade you can count on, lessons I copied into my own life. He started seeing Maya, a librarian with laughter that doesn't perform and a spine that does. She shelved my dishes after Sunday meals as if kitchens had always trusted her, and the first time she tucked a curl behind Elijah's ear, I understood how tenderness can be fluent without being loud. Zoe became a regular at those dinners, all elbows and questions and fierce opinions about poetry. She teased me about oversalting potatoes and asked for help with geometry proofs, and the sound of her Aunt Simone loosened something in my chest I hadn't realized was clenched. Nicole and I practiced a sustainable truce built from full sentences and clear boundaries. We text about schedules, school nights, and the occasional emergency science project, and we do not text about the past we can't renovate. Some evenings, I walk the neighborhood alone, no headphones, just sneakers and breath, and let the day rinse me clean. Healing, it turns out, is less a sunrise and more a series of switches you flip every time you choose what's true over what's easy. Franklin knocked once at dusk, thinner around the eyes, apology stacked carefully in his voice. I let him speak because I don't owe the past my silence, then told him I forgave him for my sake and that trust wasn't a currency we shared anymore. He nodded, cried a little, and left with his hands empty, which felt correct. On hard days, I still wake to the old panic, but it passes faster now. I make tea, water the rose, check my accounts, text Zoe a pun she will groan at, and send Elijah a photo of a courtyard that made me think of him. The scandal faded from headlines exactly on time, replaced by newer disasters, and in the quiet that followed, I found I didn't miss the noise. I teach a free Saturday workshop at the library on financial guardrails for women who do everything. And when the room laughs at my joke about receipts being love letters to your future self, I feel the surety I used to hunt for in other people's eyes. At night, before I sleep, I stand on the balcony and catalog what's mine. This key, this bank login, this name, this piece. The family I have now is smaller and beautifully durable. Me, my son, my niece, and a librarian who reads aloud on rainy afternoons. And while it isn't the picture I once insisted on, it's in focus. I can live here. I do. A year after the wedding that wasn't, I've learned endings don't thunder so much as they accumulate, habit by habit, boundary by boundary, until one afternoon you realize you haven't checked a door that used to rattle in your chest. I keep my promises small and daily now. I reconcile accounts on Fridays, water the rose bush on Sundays, text Zoe on Tuesdays about poems and proofs, and call Elijah on Thursdays to hear about a plaza he's drawing that will teach strangers to pause. On certain evenings, the light falls through my town home just right and lands on the framed photo of me and my son grinning with flour on our faces from a ruined pie. And I think, this is the picture I choose to keep. When people ask how I survived a betrayal stage like theater, I tell them suspicion isn't sin, it's a flare. I tell them evidence is merciful because it ends bargaining, and that peace is not the absence of grief, but the presence of clarity. I don't romanticize what happened. I don't name it fate or a blessing in disguise. It was theft and cruelty, and it broke things I loved. But truth became a tool I learned to hold without cutting myself, and grace became a room with windows I open when I can. Franklin exists at the proper distance now, outside the house, inside the facts. And when memories try to soften his outline, I revisit the documents like a lighthouse, not to punish myself, but to stay oriented. Sometimes Zoe curls on my couch with the library book and asks me why adults lie. I say fear makes people amateur architects of shortcuts that collapse. And then I point to the slow staircase she's climbing, honesty, apology, repair, and tell her it isn't glamorous, but it doesn't fall. On a rainy Saturday, Maya read aloud while Elijah sketched a pergola for a community garden, and I realized my living room had become the opposite of a secret, a place where every voice can be heard at normal volume. I film stories there now too, camera on a cheap tripod, microphone clipped to a sweater, and speak directly to whoever needs a steady voice in the night. I ask what city they're listening from, not for metrics, but to remind us we're neighbors under different weather.
I remind them that asking for proof is not hostility, it's stewardship. I remind them that forgiveness is a boundary you build for yourself, not a discount you hand to someone else. And I say, because it's true, that love returning after disaster is quieter, less performative, and wonderfully specific. A spare key on a nail by the door, a second mug on the rack, a calendar shared for practical reasons and not control. If you're hearing this and your jaw is tight with the truth you're afraid to name, I hope my story lends you some of my steadiness. Print your statements, gather your witnesses, and learn the weight of the red button in your hand. Step into daylight. Let the room see. Then go home and make a list for tomorrow that puts your name first without apology. Tonight, I'll stand on my balcony with the rose bush and watch the city soften into lights. Somewhere, Zoe is laughing at a text from Elijah. Somewhere, Maya is closing the library and slipping a note into a novel for a nervous teenager to find. And somewhere inside me, the woman behind the hydrangeas finally unclenches her fist and lets the morning in. If you were here for the whole story, thank you for staying. Leave a 1 so I know you made it to the end, tell me where you're listening from, and sleep knowing that truth, once invited, doesn't leave.